Somewhere in your life, you have stood in a room after someone left it for the last time and felt something that no one gave you a language for before it happened. A weight that isn't quite sadness, a disorientation that isn't quite confusion, the sense that the world has continued without asking your permission and that this is, in some way that you can't fully articulate, deeply wrong. You were not the first person to feel this, not by a long way. Archaeologists have been finding evidence of deliberate burial for at least 300,000 years. Not bodies abandoned where they fell, not remains scattered by circumstance. Intentional graves. Bodies placed carefully, sometimes with objects, sometimes with flowers, sometimes in positions that suggest someone arranged the limbs with attention, with care, with something we would recognize if we saw it on a face today. What this means is that grief, not just the feeling, but the ritual response to it, the need to do something in the face of loss, is not a modern invention. It is not a cultural construct that came with religion or civilization or language. It is one of the oldest behaviors our species has ever consistently demonstrated. You grieve because your ancestors grieved, because their ancestors grieved, because somewhere back along a line so long it disappears into the dark, a human being stood over a body and could not simply walk away. The question that should stop you for a moment is, why? From a purely mechanical evolutionary standpoint, grief is expensive. It is cognitively and physically costly. It pulls you away from food, from safety, from the practical demands of survival. A grieving animal is a distracted animal. A distracted animal is a vulnerable one. If grief were simply a malfunction, a side effect with no adaptive value, natural selection should have bred it out long ago. It didn't. Which means grief was doing something. It was earning its metabolic cost. Anthropologist and evolutionary psychologist John Archer has spent decades studying grief across species and cultures, and one of his key arguments is that grief is the price of attachment. Not a punishment for loving someone, not a failure of resilience. The direct biological cost of a system that was built, and built deliberately by evolution, to bind individuals together into groups. Consider what attachment actually does. In a hunter-gatherer band, losing a group member isn't just an emotional event. It is a practical catastrophe. That person knew things. Which routes were safe in which season, where the water sources were in dry years, how to make a particular kind of tool, how to read the specific terrain of that specific landscape. Knowledge that took years to accumulate, irreplaceable knowledge, walked out of the group's collective memory with them. Beyond knowledge, losing a group member weakens the group in ways that directly threaten everyone's survival. Fewer hands for gathering, fewer bodies for defense, fewer adults to help raise children who are now more vulnerable. Every death in a small group mattered in concrete, practical terms that modern people rarely face. Grief, Archer argues, is what happens when the attachment system, a system that evolved precisely because staying close to other people was survival critical, loses its object. The system doesn't simply switch off when the person dies. It continues to function. It keeps generating the search behavior, the social monitoring, the expectation of return that it was built to generate. We call that pain. But underneath the pain is a mechanism that was saving lives for hundreds of thousands of years by keeping people close to each other while they were alive. This is why grief doesn't feel like a decision. It doesn't feel like something you chose to do. It is a biological system doing exactly what it was designed to do in a situation it was never designed to resolve. Now here is the part that ancient human behavior reveals that purely individual psychology misses entirely. Grief in early human societies was not a private experience. It was not something you processed alone in a room. The archaeological record and the anthropological record of surviving hunter-gatherer communities both point to the same pattern. Grief was communal, physical, loud, and extended. Anthropologist Barbara King, who has studied grief across species, documents in her research that many non-human primates and social mammals show something recognizable as grief. Staying close to the body, showing behavioral changes, changes in eating and socializing for extended periods after a loss. But in humans, this individual grief response was consistently amplified and externalized by the group. Other members of the band didn't disappear when someone died. They gathered, they stayed close. They made noise together. Researcher James Pennebaker's work on the psychology of disclosure has shown something that maps directly onto this ancient pattern. People who talk about loss, who externalize it in some form, show measurably better long-term outcomes, physical and psychological, than people who suppress and internalize it. The act of expressing grief, of making it social rather than solitary, isn't a cultural nicety. It's biologically functional. It does something. And hunter-gatherer communities, without any modern psychological framework, had been doing it for hundreds of thousands of years before anyone wrote a study about it. The wailing at a funeral, the gathering of people, the stories told about the person who is gone. These are not performances of grief. They are the original grief technology, the mechanism ancient humans discovered and kept rediscovering across cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, for metabolizing loss in a way that let the group survive it and continue. There is another layer here that the ancient burial record makes quietly visible. Among the oldest deliberate graves that archaeologists have found are burials that include grave goods, objects placed with the body, tools, ornaments, food, flowers in some cases. In a Neanderthal burial site at Shanidar Cave in Iraq, there is evidence, debated but taken seriously, of pollen deposits suggesting flowers were placed with the body around 60,000 years ago. At burial sites across the world, archaeologists find evidence of ochre, red pigment, applied to remains in patterns that seem deliberate, careful, intentional. What this tells us is that ancient humans weren't just disposing of bodies. They were doing something for the person who had died, something that acknowledged the person's continued significance even after death, something that looked from the outside like care. This behavior suggests something profound and uncomfortable about the grief response. It does not respect the boundary between the living and the dead. The brain's attachment system, built to maintain connection with specific other people, does not simply accept absence as a final answer. It continues to generate behavior oriented toward the lost person. Behavior that, in the absence of the person, gets redirected toward whatever object or ritual or practice brings them symbolically close. This is why you still reach for your phone to tell a dead person something. Why you still dream of them. Why you still notice things they would have noticed and feel the need to report them somewhere. Your attachment system has not been informed that this is no longer possible. It is still, quietly, doing its job. What the ancient burial record suggests is that humans dealt with this not by suppressing the behavior, but by giving it somewhere to go. The grave goods, the rituals, the continued telling of stories about the person, these were not denial. They were acknowledgement, ways of letting the attachment system continue to function in a modified form, until it found a way to release. Modern psychology, somewhat slowly, has come to recognize something similar. Grief researcher Klass and his colleagues proposed what is called continuing bonds theory. The idea that healthy grief is not about detachment, about working through stages until the connection is severed. It is about finding a different way to hold the relationship, one that acknowledges absence without pretending the person never mattered. Hunter-gatherer communities 60,000 years ago, placing flowers on a grave, understood something about grief that Western psychology spent most of the 20th century actively arguing against. So what do you do with all of this? You don't have to do anything with it. But there is something in it that might make the experience slightly less incomprehensible when it comes, or when it comes again. Grief is not a malfunction. It is a feature. An ancient, biological, genuinely adaptive response to one of the most significant things that can happen to a social animal. The pain of it is the direct cost of having had an attachment worth grieving. The disorientation is the search system looking for something that was genuinely, irreplaceably important. The inability to simply walk away is not weakness. It is the oldest and most consistent behavior our species has ever demonstrated in the face of loss. The people who placed grave goods in the dark, 60,000 years ago, the ones who gathered around the body and stayed, the ones who applied red ochre to someone they loved with hands that knew exactly what they were doing, they were not more primitive than you. They were doing what you do, what you will do. What every human being who has ever cared about another human being has done in one form or another, since long before anyone had a word for it. You come from a very long line of people who could not simply walk away. That is not a flaw. That is exactly who we are.